In this lesson, we'll be taking a look at creating this bowling ball material. As you can see, it's a fairly complex material and there's a few layers to it. Diffuse-wise, if you take a look at the base layer, you can see some very subtle color variations in the material. And if you take a look at the reflection, as we discussed in the previous lesson, obviously you have the Fresnel effect. You have the reflections, getting sharper as we get closer to the perpendicular faces to our viewing direction. So we have matte reflection here and sharp reflection up there, for example, or down here. Also, if you just take a close look here, we have this circular pattern that affects both specular weight and the specular roughness, and also the bump to it's a very subtle effect, but it also affects the bump. So we're going to be creating this, and on top of that you can see we have this kind of dirty scratches and dark spots, actually bright spots here and there that we need to also create them. So it's going to be a complex material, and also we have that same multi-lobe specular reflections that we discussed. So we have this very bright spot, and we have another layer which is this one. You can see here is we have our very sharp reflection, and as you can see now we have more broad and rougher speculars, and we have another layer which is also going to be more spread compared to the first two specular reflections. So we basically need to have 3 layers at least to be able to create such a material. So let's go ahead and actually start creating it inside Cinema 4D. Now here's the scene I have, and if you take a look at the IPR, you can see it's a bit different compared to the previous scene, especially lighting wise. I have my orange light a bit closer to the ball. Also I have this big spotlight, a big softbox, sorry, in the front of the ball. And the reason, and as you can see from the IPR, obviously this is just way off. You can see we have these burnout areas. And the reason I kind of make it like this is because I wanted to get that blooming highlights, and it's kind of not easy to get that blooming highlights without kind of compromising a bit. Now what we can do to get that blooming highlight and don't have such a burnout scene, you can simply go ahead and go to your lights that causing this problem, which in this case is this white light. So if I just run my IPR and get to the camera here, we have this white light, one of the problems, and we have this orange light. So we can go ahead and if you select these guys and come down here, you have this diffuse contribution. So without actually compromising the specular reflections, I can reduce the amount of the diffuse contribution of this light. So as you can see now, if this was a reflective material, so if I just quickly create a new standard shader here and just increase the overall amount of specular highlights here, just for test here, and put this to 2 and apply this material to this ball. Just adjust it a bit. So you can see we still get that blooming specular highlights without actually having any problem with the diffuse contribution of the light. But if I just get back and put these guys back to 1, the light, you can see it will be kind of burned out. But I don't think there is a problem, because when we add all of that diffuse and dark colors and different specular different maps to control the specular weights and specular highlights and specular roughness, sorry, I don't think we are going to have any problems. So I'm not going to change the diffuse contribution for this white and this orange light. In this case, we just start with the scene and see if we needed to change anything. We can go ahead and change our lighting then. So let's start creating this material here. Just let me load the image again. There you go. So let's start with the diffuse. So I'm just going to stop my IPR here, and there we go. So let's create a new Arnold standard shader, and let's name it ball base or ball layer 1, layer 01. And this layer is going to be the layer with the most broad speculars. So basically these parts of our specular reflections, it's going to have a high roughness value, and then we build after that other layers to represent the layers with basically sharper speculars. So let's get started. I'm gonna open up these by middle clicking on this, and for the diffuse, which is the first part of our of this shader, we're gonna be first of all using a noise and also using a mix map. So if I come to this mix map and connect it to the and run my IPR, so I want to select just 2 color and then control the distribution of those 2 color using my noise map. If I come to my mix map, let's just also apply this material to our ball here. There we go. So if I come to my mix map here, the first color is going to be this color. So if you double click on this, you can see the value 724660. And the second color is going to be just a tad darker and more saturated compared to our previous purple color that we have selected, 57, 29, and 44, and press OK. And now if I just take a look at this noise map on my object, let's increase the scale to maybe something like 4, and obviously I want more. Let's go to something like 7. If I increase the octaves and add more detail, something like 3. So add some distortion. Obviously that's too much. Let's go to 1 or 0.5, maybe 0.6. Let's say 0.75 looks like a good number to me. Now we're going to be using this noise map as the mix amount. So I'm going to connect this noise to the mix input of my mix map. And if I connect my mix map to the Arnold Beauty port, you can see we have this distribution, even though I think we can actually have less contrast in our colors and we can select 2 close colors. But when we actually go ahead and add all of those reflections and speculars and different layers, I think this different and this contrast wouldn't be that obvious. So this is just to add a bit more irregularity to this diffuse portion of our shader. I'm also going to use an image map. So if I load this image here, and let's use this black and white image, and now I want to basically use this image to add some irregularity, and to do that I'm going to be using a layer color node. So this is our layer color. The mix map is going to be our first layer, and then we add the image as our second layer, and then connect the layer color to the Arnold Beauty port by pressing Ctrl Shift and V. And now if I select my layer color and increase layer to alpha, which is the image, you start to see that image actually taking over completely, which I guess is a bit too much here. I'm gonna use different blending mode. I think multiply is good enough. If we can just a tad, really, maybe something like that. That's good. You can see some dark spots on the diffuse, which is just what we want. And now we can connect the output of our layer color node to the diffuse color of our standard shader, and connect the standard shader to the Arnold Beauty port. And let me select my standard shader and actually increase the weight So that's basically our diffuse layer of the shader, even though we can still add more layers and make it a bit more complex. But if you take a look at this image, I really don't think that the diffuse portion of this material is that uneven, and I think that 2-3 layers will be enough to represent this shader in a good way. So now we're going to be starting with our specular portion of this shader. So now we want to create a map basically to control the specular weight of this shader here. And we have a few things to take a look at. We have basically a base layer, you know, some parts are more reflective, some parts are less reflective, but the contrast is just way too small. Also, we have this circular pattern that also affects the specular weight, right? So for example, if you take a look at these parts here, if I just zoom in here, you can see, for example, this part is more reflective compared to these darker parts, and we have our circular pattern. Some of these lines are more reflective compared to the next one. So we want to create that and implement that. Let's go ahead and actually do this. So if I just open my standard shader again, let me just lay down these guys a bit. That's going to be the diffuse. And for the specular weight, let's start just with a black and white image. So I'm going to lay down an image node, and let's use this image, number 38. And let's just also let me Control-Shift-V and run the IPR. So that's how this image is going to affect this shader. And as we are trying to connect this image to our specular weight, and the specular weight is between 0 and 1. So for example, these dark parts would have a very small amount of specular weight, and these bright parts will have basically larger amount of specular weight. And obviously we don't want that much of contrast, because right now if I come here and connect this image directly to specular weight and connect this standard shader, you can see we have this very, also just decrease the overall amount of roughness for the time being. You can see we have this part which are not that reflective, and these parts are very reflective, and obviously we don't want to make our shader this dirty. And to control the contrast of this image, I can add a color correct node, but what I like to add, actually use it a bit more, is the ramp float node. So if I just select this ramp float, hold down Alt and release it on my image, and insert after and connect this image to the input of this ramp float node. So basically have the output of this image is connected to the input of our ramp float node. I can select this ramp float node and decrease the contrast. So if, for example, if I just come here, and as you can see the contrast is smaller, I can show you directly on this image. So basically this is our original image, and this is if we go ahead and actually add the ramp float node. So basically using these 2 points, we can decrease and increase our contrast here. Now, based on the amount of specular weight that you want, you can go ahead and adjust this curve. For example, in this curve, I want to be very reflective. So what I can do is to come here and maybe just something like that. So as you can see now, we have decreased the amount of contrast. And if I just put this point down, you can see we have more contrast. I can go ahead and maybe invert my image completely if I wanted to. But in this case, let's just go to something like 0.9 and something like 0.7 maybe would work, right? And before actually adjusting anything else, let me just select my standard shader and go to the specular of this image. Obviously I want to have Fresnel, and I want my distribution to be based on GGX. And if I go to the refraction, I have to turn on Fresnel use IR to be able to use IR value to control the Fresnel amount. And in this case, I'm going to be using something like 1.4, 1.6, 1.55. As if you increase your IR value a lot, you're gonna get a metal-like shader instead of a plastic-like shader, right? So let's stay with something like 1.55 in this case. And as you can see, now we have a very subtle change in the specular weight. Some parts like here are less reflective, some parts, for example, here is also less reflective. These parts are more reflective. So we get this subtle change, which is good for this, for the time being here. So let's make sure we adjust this. And okay, I guess that's good. Let me just stop the IPR. Now, in order to add that circular pattern, I'm going to be using a noise node and just go the procedural way this time. So this is the noise node, and I'm just first of all going to connect it directly to Arnold Beauty, and let's see what we can do here. So if I increase one of these axes more than the other, you can see we get this stretched out lines. And in this case, let's see which axis is the one that we want. Not this one, X. So you can see X is the one, but we need to increase the scale. Let's see, to really see that small lines. So let's go to even 1000, 1000, maybe 500. I guess that's beautiful, right? And we can also decrease these values to get even more kind of smaller pattern. There we go. So that's our pattern, and we're going to be adding another layer to this noise, so it wouldn't be that obvious in this part. So that's our noise, which is good. Let me just, this is our diffuse part, and this is our image, and that's the noise here. So I'm going to be using another image node to basically break this perfect pattern that we have and add some irregularity to this circular pattern. So let's load another image, and this time let's search for an image that I guess this can be nice, has nice patterns. Okay, so let's open this up, and let's see if I just see it on the object here. Okay, looks like to be good, but because I want to have, obviously, as I showed you in this image, we want more specular weight, and in order to get that higher amount of specular weight, we need to have brighter image. So the first thing I'm going to do with this image is going to invert it, and obviously a simple way to invert this image is going to be using a complement node. So let's just insert after as the input. That's good. Just going to add a bit more contrast here. So I'm going to be using a color correction node, and let's insert after. And to add just a bit more contrast, I can simply decrease the amount of gamma here to something like 0.5. And now if I use layer color to basically combine this noise that we had, which is a circular pattern, and this image, I can come here and say this is my first layer and this is my second layer, and let's just connect this layer color to our Arnold Beauty and change the blending mode for our second layer until we get what we want. Multiply can be nice, but it's very dark. Add, subtract. Difference is breaking that circular pattern kind of in a nice way. So I think it's nice, but it's going to darken our specular weights a lot. So what I'm going to do is to apply another color correct node after this layer color node. So let's just hold down Alt and insert after as the input. And let's, if I run the IPR, I can, let's increase the exposure, the gamma to 1.1, maybe the contrast, and let's increase the exposure here a bit. So something like 0.2. I think that's not too bad, especially that we're going to be, again, combining this. So this is the result of these nodes that we have, which is our noise node, and then the image node that we added to break that circular pattern. And that's our original image that we actually used to control the, so basically, specular weight, right? Now we want to combine those two. And again, I'm going to be using a layer color node. So lay down another layer color node here. So this main image is going to be our first layer, and this is going to be our second layer. And let's connect this layer color to the Arnold Beauty and run the IPR. I'm going to increase the layer 1 alpha and increase the layer 2 alpha. And let's just change the blending mode to something like multiply. And I guess we're getting very close to what we want. So we get this nice specular pattern and this overall distortions. And if I come down here, I can now connect this layer color output of it to the specular weight directly. So let's do that and connect the standard shader and see what we get. So if you zoom in, you can see this circular pattern here and the nice amount of reflection unevenness and specular unevenness that's just not too much and not too subtle, and we can see it in different places, which is basically what we want. So let's just the IPR finish its render, and after that we can go ahead and actually talk about the specular roughness and control the roughness with a bunch of other nodes and maps. And then we will be basically finished with the first layer and start talking about the other layers of this material. So this is our basically our diffuse and specular together, and as you can see we have a nice result. And now when we add actually the specular roughness to this combination, we're going to get even better results. So for the specular roughness, what I'm going to be doing, as I mentioned, that the specular roughness, one of its components is this circular pattern, and also the same map that we use to control the base layer of our specular weight, which was, if I come back here, which was this image BW38. We can actually use it to control our specular roughness at the same time. So let's actually start doing that. So there we go. Let me just come down here a bit. I'm just going to just duplicate this image, which is image 38, and just let's close in. In specular roughness, if I select the standard shader here, you can see the value goes between 0 and 1. And when you increase the roughness value, you are going to get, obviously, you can see more broad and blurrier speculars, right? So 0 is always black and 1 is always going to be white, right? So as you, we need this base layer to be a lot blurrier compared to the layers on top of it. So let's go ahead and let's see what our image have and basically adjust it based on our needs. So if I just press Ctrl+Shift, this is the image that we have. Obviously, for the material that and for the shader that we have in mind, this is way too contrasty. And as we use the same map for our reflection, if you remember, these dark spots were having less amount of specular. But right now, if I actually connect this image directly to my specular roughness, these dark spots are gonna have sharper reflections compared to these white spots, because these guys are going to be having a roughness of 0. These guys are going to have something like 0.7, 0.6. So if I just come down here and connect this image here to the specular sorry, just come back here. This is our standard shader. So let's connect it to the specular roughness and connect the standard shader here. So you can see these dark parts that I showed you in the image are having actually sharper reflection compared to these white parts. And obviously, because these parts are also have less amount of reflection compared to the other parts because of the map that we use in our specular weight, we want to invert this image. So the parts that actually have less amount of reflection also would be more blurry compared to the other parts. So let me just go to the image here, and I'm just going to be using a RAM floats node again to control the contrast of the image. So RAM floats and insert after input. And if I come here and obviously invert this image, you can see now the darker parts are having are actually, as you can see, more blurred, and they are so blurred that you can basically you can't see any reflection. So let me just show in separate window, and we want to decrease this overall amount of trust. So if the image completely white, you can see if I just compare this, take a look at this image right now, you can see we have a fully white image. That's our original image, right? So we want to convert this and basically invert this, so we have something like that. Now this basically brighter spots are going to be blurrier, but we want to have less contrast. So for the first layer, I'm thinking something like 0.7 and 0.5, so a very small amount of contrast here. So let's see, I guess something like this wouldn't be too bad. Just trying to adjust these values to something like this, and you can also go ahead and using these handles decide how you want exactly this image to be shown. So this is not too bad. And if I now connect the standard shader directly, you can see we have a nicer specular basically roughness using this image. Now obviously we need to control and add the circular pattern also to our base layer here. So to do that, let's see, we obviously, so this is the noise that we actually created to, if I just come down here, there we go. So that's our circular pattern, if you remember, right? So we added this color correction to add a bit more detail, but right here, these nodes are ones that actually control and creates the circular pattern, and also its breakup image that we used for, which was image 05. So instead of actually going and creating again, we're going to be using these nodes, right? And to do that, what I'm going to be doing, let me just get these guys a bit closer to maybe something like that. Let's load the layer color node and start combining the image that we just created to control our specular roughness and the circular pattern. And what I'm going to be doing, just I want to have a bit control on the colors of this image. So if I just have this layer input and press play right now, this is what we get, right? I just want to be a bit more brighter because, as I mentioned, because we want this layer to be very rough and this image kind of is a bit too dark, it's going to make this layer to have sharper specular reflection. So we want to make it brighter while you closer to one, so we have rougher specular roughness basically. So let's go ahead. So this image is going to be our first layer, and let's increase the layer alpha. And this image, this circular pattern, is going to be our second layer. And if I connect this layer directly and increase the layer to alpha, also let's change this to something like multiply and start decreasing this, something like 0.4. It also, as you can see, it makes the overall image a bit darker, which is a bit this image, this color combination is very close, because I think this what we had here was a bit too bright, and it's made our specular roughness to be way too rough. But by adding this noise map, basically this circular pattern, not only we darken our image and added that circular pattern, we also darkened our overall image and overall map that controls our specular roughness. And this way we are going to have a bit sharper reflection, sharper specular reflections compared to the previous render. So if I just come here and this time connect this layer color node to the roughness and press Ctrl Shift V here, as you can see now we get a tad brighter image, and now as you can see we are getting very close to the image that we had. I hope I'm not going too advanced here, and if you're confused, please just watch the course a few times. And if you are really thinking this stuff are a bit way too advanced, I recommend that watch the comprehensive introduction to Arnold for Cinema 4D that I have on mographplus.com, and there I really go ahead and take a very close look at standard shader. And also there's a free tutorial, actually I shared that standard shader tutorial for free on Vimeo and YouTube, so you can go to Mograph Plus's channels on Vimeo and YouTube and actually watch the tutorials for the Arnold standard shader. So it would be, I think, a bit easier to digest if you think this stuff is a bit too advanced. So as you can see, the IPR is finished, and I see one problem, and the problem is this is just way too contrast in these specular roughness. If you take a look at the original image, it's just way smoother compared to what we having here. So I think the main problem that we have and causing this is going to be the circular pattern that basically comes down here to control our second layer here. So what I can do, we have added this color correct, now we can actually use it and put it to good use. So if I just stop my IPR here and open this window, and if I connect the, this is the layer color. Now this is basically what we are just using it right now as the second layer, and as you can see it's just way too contrasty. So what I'm going to do is to start just adding some changes. So let's increase the gamma maybe to 1.1. Let's decrease the contrast here to 1.2 maybe, or 1.45. Let's just go to 1.5, round numbers. And the exposure, if I increase this exposure to something like 1.6, I think we're getting better results. 1.6 looks like to be nice enough. I think that's way better. This is our original image. It's way too contrasty, and that's our current image. Perfect. So let's go ahead and actually connect our standard shader one more time, and hopefully if we just run IPR here, we should see that this time it's not that contrasty, hopefully. Now, compared to the previous render, this is way smoother. So, if I just turn off this region and let the IPR go, we're basically done with our first standard shader with our base layer, which is going to be the rougher, more broad specular reflection layer. And now we start to layering up, and as you can see, we actually haven't added any bump map yet, and the reason is we can add the bump map in our final shader when we actually combine all of these standard shaders here, right? So there you go. So that's our first standard shader. Let's just wait for the IPR for finish, and when it's finished, I'll be back to start adding other layers. So as you can see, the render is finished, and we have a beautiful first layer render. If you take a look at the original image that we have here, Now it's time to actually add the other specular layers as we discussed in the previous lessons. Now this is our base layer, and now we need to add two other layers to make it a bit more complex. We can go ahead and just add one layer with less roughness and combine it with this base layer, but I'm gonna go ahead and actually add two layers. So the next layer would be a bit sharper than this base layer, and the first layer is going to be the sharpest one. For example, for these edges, as you can see, they are just way sharper and they have sharper reflection compared to these parts. So we need another layer for that, and we then can go ahead and actually combine those three layers. So the only change in the next two standard shaders that we want to have, and we want to basically adjust those, are going to be is going to be the specular roughness. So we just want to have less specular roughness in our other two layers. And in order to do that, we can go ahead and do it two ways. One of the ways would be, this is our base layer, so let me just stop the IPR. I can go ahead and duplicate this layer, open it up, go to the network editor. This is what basically controls the specular roughness. Select the ramp float node, and as I mentioned, as we get closer to 1, we're going to have rougher surface, and as we decrease these values, we're going to get sharper surface. So if I just connect and apply this material and open the network again, and also just run the IPR quickly. So if I come here and decrease these guys, just go to the roughness, you can see we start to have sharper specular reflection. And let's say this is for example, our second layer, and I can go ahead and create a third layer, and this one is gonna be the sharpest one. So if I just come here and actually connect this guy, I can select the ramp float node here and just decrease this guys even more, so make it way sharper. And then now that we have these three specular layer, we can go ahead and create an Arnold shader network here and start combining these guys. So I can let me just adjust the size of this window here. So what I can do, I can just reference the first one, the second one, the third one, and add a layer color node, and start combining these three layers. But this wouldn't be so procedural. So for example, if I wanted to come here and change the diffuse color for this material, I have to open up all of these materials and adjust what I want. And as the only change we want to have is just in this ramp float node, we can go ahead and do it a bit more procedurally. This is one way of doing it. Maybe it's a bit simpler and we don't get that clunky shader network that we're going to have in a moment. But as I like proceduralism, and if you can do something procedurally, and if you can do it in a way that you wouldn't to adjust stuff a lot harder later on, so do it that way. So let's go ahead and actually apply the base material here, and let's just go ahead and delete these other layers that we just created. So let's open up the standard shader and open the network editor here and start adjusting this. Let's just make a bit more space here. So the procedure here, so I'm gonna just go ahead and make more space. The first thing I want to do is to just duplicate this standard shader, right? So this is our standard shader, control and drag. And for this standard shader, the color, the diffuse color, and the specular weight are going to be exactly the same thing, and we just want to change the specular roughness a bit. So let's just go ahead and connect this guy. So this is our diffuse color, the same input for our first standard shader. This is our specular weight, right? And if I come down here, there we go. Now for the third layer, which is going to be our specular roughness, let's just see what we want. The only node we want to change is obviously this ramp float node. But as the layer color here is have this input, we need both the layer color and both the RAM float node. So if I just come here and control click these two guys, so this image is going to be the input for this here too, and the color correction node, which is connected to our circular noise pattern, is going to be our second input, right? And they have the same settings from our first layer color. So right now I can connect these guys as the specular roughness, right? And if I come here and connect this and run the IPR, you can see at the timing we have the exact same result that we had from our first standard shader, right? But if I just come here and select my RAM float node as we did a few moments ago, I can go ahead, select these 2 points and make the overall image darker, so we have less or more sharp and less blurry image. So let's see. Let's go to something like 0.4 and maybe 0.2, just a tad more contrast here, 23, less contrast, sorry, and maybe 38. So that's our second layer, right? The only thing we changed was that. So now for the third layer, we're going to be just duplicating the same thing. So I'm just going to duplicating the standard shader here, and this is going to be our, and that's going to be the sharpest one. So that's going to be our diffuse color, that's going to be our specular weights. So let's just connect that here, and if I just come down here, and we just need to basically duplicate these two guys again. So let's connect the image node to our RAM float node here, and the color correct node, we need to have it as the second layer here. So as you can see, we're basically having the same as we did. And let's connect these guys to our specular roughness and connect this third standard shader, the sharpest one, to our image, and we're going to get the same result as our previous render. But now I can select the RAM float node and just darken the overall image so we have sharper reflections. I'm thinking something like possibly 0.1, and again just contrast something like 0.02. So as you can see, it's a very sharp layer, and that's going to be more dominant on the edges. So there we have. So that's our network that we have right now, and I know it's a bit clunky, but I think it's way more procedural right now. If I wanted to, for example, change the overall color of my image, I can simply go ahead and just change this mix node, and it will apply to all the 3 layers that we have. So that's perfect. Now the next thing I want to do is to start basically combining these 3 standard shaders, and let's see what we can do there. First, let's take a look at the image that we have, and with this mentality we can combine these layers a bit better. What I see here, just to take a closer look at these more frontal faces, you can see we have our first rougher standard shader, and then these sharper specular reflections can be our second standard shader. If you remember, we decreased the overall amount of roughness to be a bit more sharper. And as we go closer to the edges, you can see we start to see a lot sharper speculars. So based on this, in this frontal angle, we want to have more of our first standard shader and our second standard shader. And as we get closer to our edges, we need to basically increase more of our third standard shader. So let's go ahead and start combining these guys. Obviously we need a layer color node here, so I'm just going to lay down a layer color node and just get closer a bit. And that's our first standard shader. Let's connect it to the first layer. That's our second standard shader. And this is the third one with the sharpest specular highlights and reflections. So that's our layer 3. Right now, obviously our layer 1 should be 1, and the layer 2 and 3 alpha will be controlled with, if you remember from our first lesson, with a ramp float node in conjunction with a utility node. So let's just start preparing our network here. So I'm gonna first lay down a utility node and a complement node. I told you why we use complement node, but I'm gonna just show you again here. So let's see, that's the complement node. So let's just take these two guys and just start. So that's our utility node, and if I come here and just adjust the size of this window a bit, and if I just connect it directly, you can see, press play. So we have our white colors and our black colors 0 to 1. Obviously, because we want to combine these guys and we want our second layer, which is sharper, which has sharper specular reflection, to appear more on the edges, we want to invert this image. So we are going to be using a complement node. And if I connect the complement node, now you get the opposite effect. And to have more control, we use the ramp float node after our complement node. So ramp float, hold down Alt, insert after as the input. So now we have our output of complement nodes connected to the ramp float node. And these guys are going to be controlling our second layer here, layer alpha. So let's just come here and say layer 2 alpha. Now, before actually connecting this layer color to the Arnold Beauty, let's see what we can create using this curve. Right now, our first layer, which is represented right now by this block color, is on the very frontal angles, and these white colors are going to be our second layer, which is correct, but we just need to adjust it a bit. I want to have a bit of my second layer also, which has rougher specular reflection on this frontal angle, so I can just increase my darks a bit. Let's go to something like maybe 0.25, something like that, or even 0.2, and can adjust this. Just trying to adjust the node, and I think this is not too bad at all. Maybe we can even decrease how much it's blended on the edges, something like this. So this is what controls the edges here, right? So let's just go to something like maybe 0.995. So something like this is kind of very close, actually. Just there we go. So that's not too bad. And for our third layer alpha, if I just come down here and just duplicate this ramp float and use the complement node as the input here, and that's going to be controlling the layer 3 alpha. So layer 3 alpha. And for the layer 3 alpha, we only want this layer to appear on the, if you take a look at this image, it's just, there is just a tad of it, maybe you can see in this part, but just not too much, maybe a very small amount. But as we get closer, we see a lot sharper reflections. So let's try to implement that. It's a bit hard to actually see what's exactly happening. So just to demonstration and to make sure you understand the effect, I'm going to actually disconnect this layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 and just use simple images. So that's going to be our layer 1, let's say pure red, our layer 2, pure green, and our layer 3, pure blue, right? So just connect this layer color here directly. So that's what we get right now. We have our base color, then we have our layer 2 alpha, the green one. Let's just go to the layer 3 for the time being and disable it. Now this is our layer 1 and our layer 2. And our layer 3 now can start, that's layer 3 alpha. And now as you can see, it's more apparent on the edges, and I can go ahead and actually adjust this behavior using my layer color node. Obviously we need it to be on the edges and a very small amount of it on these frontal angles. So I'm going to really decrease this value, maybe to something like that. Right, edges, and we start to see it's more as we get closer, maybe something like this. Let's just make it way close. If I just do that, you can see just on the very edges we see the third layer, which is our blue color, but I wanted kind of to start combining a bit. So thinking something like that. I'm just trying to adjust this curve really, and obviously it takes time to get the result that you're after. I think that's a bit better. Okay, now let's see what we get if we go ahead and actually use our layers, and then we can adjust them a bit better. So that's our, make sure we're doing it right. So that's our first layer. That's our, just make these guys maybe just a bit here. That's our second standard shader, layer 2, and that's our layer 3. So layer 3. And we have layer 2 alpha and layer 3 alpha here. So there we go. Let me just save the scene. Connect the standard shader here to the Arnold Beauty. And hopefully we can now start to see some of that beautiful combination effect going on. There we go. Now it really depends on how much you want to combine these guys and maybe add more, you know, roughness to your image, or you can adjust this guy simply using this RAM float node. For example, if I just start this RAM float node, if I wanted to, right now this point is 0.2. If I wanted to be more blurry, I can just have this layer to be less combined, and this way the first layer will take over, and we are going to get, you know, blurrier reflections compared to this one. Or if I just come here and select this guy, and I can just, can see, just seeing this guys. So you can see now we basically removed that sharp reflection on these frontal angles, and as you can see we have this sharp reflection only on the edges. It's really up to you and how you want to proceed and how much basically of that effect you want to have, right? I think that's not too bad, but let's add another. Maybe here, start. I mean, if I increase this guy, you can see just gets more blended into our first layer. Just see these parts here. So, I mean, really based on you. So you can see it gets a bit sharper compared to our previous render. And if I go ahead, you can see now it's get blurrier. So sharper, blurrier. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. I think in this case something like 0.2, 0.2, something like that is not too bad. So there you go. So that's what we have right now. Now we still have actually one other layer to add. Just let's wait for the IPR to finish, and when the IPR is done, we come back and add the other layers that we have, which is going to be this kind of bright scratches and spots here and there. We'll be adding that, and it's going to be very simple. So after the IPR is finished, I'll be back with you. Okay, so this is our render here, and as you can see, we have decided to make it a bit sharper compared to the image reference. As I showed you, you can simply go ahead and make it rougher if you wanted to, I mean the specular reflections. Now let's go ahead and actually add the fourth layer, which is going to be those bright spots. So let's just lay down a simple standard shader here, and let's put it maybe about here. Shader, just a bit closer. Let's see. Okay, my computer is acting a bit weird here. Just let me one moment. So there we go. So for the first standard shader, as the fourth layer, which is those bright spots, I'm gonna just come here and let's use this color here. I've prepared this color so we don't have to look around. 223, 203, and 180, and press OK. For the overall weights, let's go to something like 0.3, and for the roughness, maybe if you just take a look at this material here in the preview, I'm just going to make it a bit rougher, maybe 0.2 here, or 0.2 is enough. And obviously it should have some reflection, just a tad, really, something like that, and it should be very rough, so something like 0.75, 0.8, and that's basically it. Now this is going to be connected to the layer 4, so that's our layer 4, and to control the alpha, sorry, what am I doing? Let's lay down an image node to control these layers alpha. So the image I'm going to be using is going to be this image here, and let me just see it on my model here. If I just press play, this is what we have. If I go to UV coordinate tab, I think I need a bit more tiling, something like 2 and 2, and let's offset it a bit, just so we get a less busy pattern. I think something like this is quite good, and this is going to be our layer for alpha. And if I just save this and run the IPR one more time, now you start to get that spots and stretches, which is nice actually to have, and it will add a lot. So that's about the fourth layer, and one thing that still we need to add is actually the bump. Even though if you take a look at this image, the surface is very soft, adding the bump I think is going to add that other level of realism, even though it's going to be ever so slight, but it's gonna really affect the overall render. So let me just wait for the IPR to finish, and when the IPR is finished, we start adding the bump map. Let's get started. So this is our final render. As you can see, it's nice and slight, even though it hasn't been color corrected, but I think it's very close to the reference image that we have. So let's get started with the bump here. I'm gonna open up the network that we have, and that's what we have right now, right? So let's get started with the bump map. obviously we need a bump map here. So that's our bump, and the shader is going to be the layer color. Just connect it here. And the map, we're gonna be combining a few layers. The first layer actually I want to add is going to be the same image that we used for our starting part of our specular weight. So if I just come down here, you can see this one, BW38, and it's a RAM float, right? So I can come here, I can connect this thing directly if I wanted to really, but I think I'm just going to control drag this bump, these two guys here, and let's see. So we have our image 38, which is basically this guy, and I just want to go ahead and actually adjust it a bit. So if I select the RAM float node that we have here, I'm just going to, if I connect this directly and open this thing up, let's see, separate window, let's try to something like 0.6 here, and this can be something like 0.3 maybe. There we go. And that's going to be our first layer of our noise map, of our bump map. So also in the layer color again. So layer color, and that is, let's make some space here. There we go. So that's our first layer. Layer 1, let's increase the alpha. For the second layer, I would like to actually have the same circular pattern that we have in the specular weight and the specular roughness. So I can go ahead and actually find that, which is, there we go, that's what we need. And I'm just going to connect this directly. So this is our specular, this is our noise and circular pattern. So if I just, these two guys are just way too, let me, this is our layer color. It's sometimes you get lost here, but here's the layer color. So we want to use this as the second layer. So let me just get this thing a bit, let's move it way back here, and that's the circular pattern that we have. If you remember, basically this is this image. If I connect this, there you go. So we have both our circular pattern and our you know, the image that breaks that perfect pattern. So that's going to be our second layer. Layer 2. Let's just move this thing back to where it was. There we go. So that's our second layer, and there we go. Now for the third layer, I just want to add you know, some scratches. If you take a look at this image here, you can see you get this kind of scratches here and there, and it wouldn't be bad if we had some of those too. So if I just lay down another image node here and go to something scratchy like this, I just if you can see the scratches, I mean, it's a very soft and smooth surface, but I think they are kind of going down a bit. So right now these guys are, if I just connect this thing directly, you can see these guys are, the scratches are white, and I want them to be a bit black so they kind of go down on our surface. So simply we can use a RAM float Sorry. So we can use the RAM float node here as the input and simply just invert the image like that. And this is going to be our third layer. Layer 3 here. Now, one thing that I really think it's the most important part of our bump map is the overall unevenness of the surface. If you take a look at these highlights, you can see some waviness going through. It's not that much, but it's there. So let me just use a noise map to actually achieve that. And we're going to be using this noise as our fourth layer. This is our noise, and let's connect this noise directly first of all and see what we have. So this is our noise map. I think it should be on the surface here. So let's save this and run the IPR. So first of all, scale, let's increase it. I think 8, increase the octave. Maybe let's add some distortion. I think 0.5 is a good number. Let's increase the amplitude so it's a bit more contrasty. And this is basically going to be the layer 4 here. So let's just connect this to layer 4 of our noise map. And if I just connect this layer map, let's just adjust some of these guys. So our layer 2, which is the kind of scratches, the circular pattern that we have, let's go to something like 0.5, maybe 0.2, 0.25. Layer 3 is the scratches, so let's start, this is way too much for this layer, 0.5 would be enough. And layer 3, let's just increase this value. Now you see those scratches here and there. Just 0.25 maybe, just so we have some effects. And for the fourth layer, just actually the layer 3, I think if you just change it to multiply, it would be better. So you can see some scratches here and there. And layer 4, which is our noise, I'm going to be making it a bit more effective, something like 0.5. So we get that overall changes. Now this is the overall image that we have here, which is not too bad. And if I just come down here to my bump map and connect this as the, I'm just going to save it because I've had some crashes here and there, so save it a lot to make sure the progress is saved. So that's going to be the bump map. And if I just connect this, connect this here, you start to see the bump map, which is way too much at the time, and we definitely need to go ahead and decrease the overall amount of bump here. Right, this is way too much. And let's start with 0.1. And it really depends on you and how much bump you want, but I think the effect is even way subtler than this. So let's go to maybe 3. Something like 1 point. So I think it's very close to what we want. It's subtle, even I don't know. Maybe let's go to something like 0.15 here. That's good enough. So the shader is basically complete. Let me just save this. And now the only thing that remains is just to add, do some color correction and just make it a bit closer. That's the network that we have. And I think if you take a look at this and think about it logically, it's really not that complex. And we can go ahead and just do it very close. Let me just make this noise stuff. That's the first layer. Unfortunately, right now the X group that we have in Xpresso doesn't work to kind of make these things a bit more tidier and add some nodes. You can simply right click and add X group, but it wouldn't work at the time being. Hopefully SolidAngle will create that, but just to make things a bit easier to recognize, I'm going to just select these guys and change their color. So that's going to be the bump map, and you can start, you know, adding different things. This is the layer 4 that we have, and we just can come here and maybe put this thing here and put the layer alpha a bit closer. This is the nodes that kind of controls the overall alphas for different blendings, and just colorful. And this is our basically diffuse nodes, and these guys are the specular nodes here. Let me just use a green color, and these are the ones that control the roughness. So let's something like that. So now it's a bit tidier, and that's the standard shaders that we have. They have this green color, right? So now, as you can see, it's a bit tidier, but you know, that's what we have at the time being. I was going to wait for the kind of IPR to finish. And one thing actually I want to do is to kind of add it, maybe adjust the colors a bit in a package like maybe After Effects, or even in Picture Viewer we can adjust it a tad. So what I'm going to do here is actually just to go ahead and actually render this to the Picture Viewer, and when the render is finished, I'll be back just to add some final adjustment and some color correction in the Picture Viewer. So let's just start the render and see what we get. So that's our render, and it's 1000 by 1000 pixel image. So it took about 6 minutes, which for such a complex shader is quite acceptable. Now, this is a raw render, obviously, and I would never show this to anyone unless I adjust the colors to my liking in Photoshop or After Effects. But as this is not a color correction course and just a shader course, I'm just going to be using the filter tab of Cinema 4D's Picture Viewer. So if I just enable the filter, and let me just also have my original picture here. Let's see. So I'm putting this on my other monitor and just look at it while I'm adjusting these values. Let's see. Let's increase the saturation. Maybe into 20, into 30. It's getting close. Let's add a bit more contrast. So maybe something like 20. Oh, that's too much. And the contrast obviously is going to ruin the image. It's too contrasty, but if I just go ahead and increase the brightness to something like 5, and now hopefully decreasing the gamma should solve our problems. Maybe a bit more saturation here. Now that's without filter, and that's with the filters. And maybe the brightness can be about 3. You can see 1% how drastically changes the image. And if I just come here and try to compare these two guys, I think they are pretty close. I mean, if we don't have the exact same lighting that in this picture, we would never get the exact same feeling. But if you be fair and compare the details that we have in this two image here, you can find out that it's kind of fairly close to what we have, right? There we go. So I'm just going to put my brightness to 0.4 here possibly. So that's our final render, and I think it's very, very close to what we had. I think it was a long lesson, but hopefully you learned a lot. And if you think it was too complex, please just rewatch the whole lesson. We still, I think, have 1 or 2 lessons talking about creating plastic shaders, and after that we go ahead and create other stuff. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next lesson.